Hey, everybody. Welcome. Happy True Crime Wednesday. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time, my name is Lori Hellis, and I am a retired criminal attorney currently living in Idaho, where I'm writing a book about the Vallow Daybell case. And every week we get together and talk about what's been going on in the true crime world. So we have a bit to talk about tonight, a few different cases, some things a little bit different than we've talked about before, but cases that I thought might be of interest to all of you. So let's start out with the Vallow Daybell case, because that's kind of where I always start. Chad Daybell's trial has been set for April 1st, April Fool's Day, through the month of May. So the entire month of April and May have been set aside for his case in Boise in Ada County. There's been no word on whether our cameras will be allowed or not, and I don't think we'll hear much about that anytime in the near future. It was interesting. There were a couple of filings that happened recently. One was, sorry, I was just turning the dinger off on my phone so it won't go off throughout the whole show. One of them, interestingly enough, was an order that the judge filed on June 1st, ordering that the trial exhibits not be released until after Daybell's trial, even though they were all pretty much presented at trial. There wasn't anything particularly new. And coincidentally, after I filed motions to unseal some of the documents that are still sealed. So the judge has now filed an order ordering that none of the trial exhibits in Lori's case be released until Chad's case next year. The hearing that the motion that Lori's attorneys filed for motion for new trial is going to be heard tomorrow. I think that the state has done a pretty good job of outlining all of the reasons why their bases for the new trial don't fly. I think the only one that could fly in an appeal would be the issue of changing the indictment. Do I think the judge is going to change his mind on that and admit he was wrong? No, because that's not this judge. I have certainly seen judges who are willing to admit when they make errors and are wrong, but I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for Judge Boyce to do that. So the hearing on that motion is tomorrow, and it will be held in Fremont County. No indication that it will be, in fact, Nate Eaton's request to televise or to live stream that was denied. I'm assuming that we'll get audio from it at some point, as is usually the case. Probably the biggest news coming out on the Vallow trial is that the judge has entered an order as to who is a victim and who can present victim impact statements at Lori's sentencing. And it sucks, but he's probably right. I've read his order and the rationale behind it, and I think he's right. I'm not going to be the person to stand up and deny when Judge Boyce gets it right. So I think that the legal reasoning is correct. It still sucks because it means that only the same people who were identified during the trial as immediate family are going to be able to present victim impact statements. That means that none of the other family members who have asked, including Larry Woodcock, will be able to present victim impact statements. At this point, of the people who have asked to present victim impact statements, only Colby K, because she is allowed because she represents JJ, and Summer, who has been appointed as the representative for Tylee, will be able to present victim impact statements. They are also the only people who are allowed to have input in the pre-sentencing investigation. I realize that is distressing and is upsetting for a lot of folks. I'm sure that it is very upsetting for Larry Woodcock. Unfortunately, I think the judge's decision is supported under Idaho law. It's very unfortunate. A lot of states take a lot broader view of who a victim is, but Idaho does not. So the statute is pretty clear, and I think the judge went through the case law and his reasoning is sound. So it appears that only those three are going to be able to offer impact statements. So moving on, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Koberger case. There's been a whole bunch of questions about this business about whether or not he has an alibi. And a lot of this information has gotten conflated with information that was coming out of Pennsylvania. So I want to be sure that we're actually talking about two different things here. So there was some discussion about whether or not his family could present any sort of an alibi. And there was also some discussion about whether or not his parents had been called to a grand jury to discuss another case, a separate missing case. It was determined in the process of that investigation that Koberger had a solid alibi for when that woman in Pennsylvania disappeared. That is not the same as the issue of whether or not he has an alibi for the night of the University of Idaho murders. So let's not run those things together and conflate them, because they are not the same. But in Idaho, and I want everybody to just calm down, as one YouTube presenter recently said, y'all just calm down. So calm down, everybody. In Idaho, the defense can present an alibi at any point during the trial. But if the district attorney, the prosecutor, asks them to identify whether or not they have an alibi, they have to respond within 10 days. So it's very typical for the prosecutors to send the defense a notice and say, you need to tell us whether or not you're going to present an alibi defense. That's what happened in this case. But let's understand that there are somewhere around 50 terabytes. Now, I'm not a computer expert, but I know a terabyte is a huge amount of data. There are somewhere around 50 terabytes of information. A lot of it is raw computer data. So let's remember, when Sarah Adams, I love you too. She just posted in the comments, Judge Boyce wears pull-ups to court. So very cute. Anyway, what happens when you are trying to determine whether or not your client has an alibi is you want to make sure of what's in the discovery, that you're not missing anything that's in the discovery. And you want to make sure that you have thoroughly looked at all of the evidence before you file that notice of alibi. mostly because you only get one shot at it. So you want to make sure that you're doing it right. What that means is that they're asking for extra time because of this volume of all of this data. It does not mean that Kohberger is saying he has an alibi. It does not mean that he is saying he doesn't have an alibi. It only means that they're asking for more time before they are required to file that notice. Let's remember that this information that they have gotten, a lot of it, let's think about the Lori Vallow case. In the Vallow case, when it came time for the state to present the information, the GPS information about what was going on, who was where phones were, all of those things, they took all of that raw data and they synthesized it into a presentation that they could use to show and illustrate where the phones were. They overlaid it over a map. They did a bunch of work to make that information understandable and processable to the average person. So that is the piece that has not been done for Kohberger. And we were told in the Vallow case there were somewhere around 2 terabytes of information. Now they're saying there are 50 terabytes of information in the Kohberger case. We are going to continue to see these massive amounts of discovery data because law enforcement is doing so much more to collect digital information. And digital information comes in volumes. So we're going to see this on and on. We're going to see this continue, and we're going to see it get worse as more electronic information gets collected. So Kohberger's team right now is combing through all that information, is processing it in a way that's going to make it understandable. I mean, in some instances, they're literally having to go apply computer apps to the information to make it understandable, to make it at all, to sort out the patterns and make it all completely remotely understanding. So it's going to take time. That's why they've asked for more time. Y'all calm down, because it doesn't mean that Kohberger has an alibi. It doesn't have anything to do with Pennsylvania, and it doesn't mean anything more than that at some point the defense is going to have to tell the prosecution, yes, we are claiming there's an alibi or not. We don't know yet. And it's probably going to be months before that's determined. I want to talk about a really interesting case. Because we're all interested in true crime, and we follow true crime creators like me and like Gigi and like lots of other true crime creators. And it's been the place where the internet and criminal investigations come together is becoming blurred. And we're seeing more and more opportunity to for people who are involved in online sleuthing to turn up information that becomes usable or becomes important in investigations. So this case is really interesting. This is the case of Alyssa Turney. The case is out of the greater Phoenix area. And Alyssa Turney disappeared in 2001, so 22 years ago. She was 16, I believe, junior in high school. She disappeared on the last day of school of her junior year. And her sister, Sarah, became a TikTok phenom by posting all over TikTok that she was trying to solve the mystery of her sister's disappearance. And this is a case where the further you get into it, the more convoluted and sordid and sad the whole case is. So Alyssa Turney and Michael Turney, who is her stepfather who adopted her, are the sort of the focus of this case. Alyssa's mother died when she was about 9 years old of lung cancer, and the stepfather then was raising 6 children. He was raising kids from his first relationship, Alyssa and her brother, and the one child, Sarah, that he had with Alyssa's mother. So Sarah and Alyssa are biologically half sisters. It has come out that Michael Turney was abusing Alyssa for years, since she was a very young child, and continued to abuse her until her disappearance. There were some reports at different times, but they were never pursued. And unfortunately, Alyssa's abuse fell through the cracks. He would, interestingly enough, when the police started investigating him for potentially having been involved in Alyssa's disappearance and presumed death, because she's never been heard from since. Michael Turney's story was that she was a rebellious teen and she ran away from home and moved to California and never wanted to have any contact with anybody ever again. But as they were in about 2007, as they were investigating the potential of his involvement in the case, they uncovered that he was plotting to bomb the local labor union office because he was upset with the local labor union. He also has some really interesting delusions. He believed that the labor union was somehow involved in Alyssa's disappearance. He's made all kinds of very strange and almost ludicrous claims about, very strange, irrational claims about the labor unions, about about their involvement in Alyssa's disappearance. He's claimed that she's alive. He's claimed that she's dead. So when they were investigating in the mid-2000s, they discovered that he had a virtual arsenal, including a bunch of pipe bombs and a lot of other guns and ammunition, and that he was planning, and a 38-page manifesto where he was planning to get revenge on the labor union. He was arrested on all the bomb and convicted on all the bomb charges and went to prison for 10 years and was released in 2017. During that time, Sarah was assured that the police were still working Alyssa's cold case and that they believed that Michael Turney was responsible for her death and that they were going to prosecute him. Then in 2017, when he got out of jail and Sarah started saying, okay, so how come you haven't arrested him? They said, we don't have a body and we're not going to prosecute without a body. Well, that was different than what Sarah had been told. And they also said, you need to get more media attention. And she did. That prompted her to start a YouTube or a TikTok channel and to go kind of wall to wall with her sister's story about what was going to, about where she was, and her father's level of involvement. And finally, after years of her, 20 years of her pounding the table and saying, we need to resolve my sister's disappearance, finally, the police arrested Michael Turney, and he is currently awaiting trial. Now, I looked up online to see where he was in the trial situation, and his trial was scheduled to have started May 9th. It didn't start, and it appears that they are still wrangling over motions having to do with prior bad acts. Now, we've heard all about that in the Valllow trial. It appears that they are trying to keep out any information that might spill over about him being abusive to his stepdaughter. And it appears that's what they're trying to keep out. But clearly it's going to go to motive the same way that Charles Vallow's death went, to show a plan or a pattern. And this is clearly going to go to motive, because he had a motive to murder her, because she was getting to the age where she was no longer willing to stay quiet, and she was getting rebellious, and she was talking. So that is a really interesting case. I'm going to keep watching it. I think that Sarah Turney has been very, very brave, very courageous to keep pressing for some justice for her sister. I know that she has become very, very frustrated with the system, but I have to give her huge credit for not giving up. So that is a really interesting case. I think we should keep watching. There were some new filings in the Murdaugh case, which were fascinating. And our dear Emily D. Baker's got a breakdown of these documents if you really want to take a deep dive into them. But what has happened is that Bland and Richter, Eric Bland and his partner, have filed a motion for the court to impose sanctions on Alec Murdaugh's lawyers. That would be Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin. And the reason he has done this is because he says that they have filed frivolous motions in the case, asking to set aside the confession of judgment that Alec Murdaugh gave the Satterfield family. So this gets a little bit in the weeds legally. And like I say, if you want a really deep dive into the legal weeds, tune in to Emily D. Baker. She's got a deep dive into it today. But to give everybody a little surface analysis of it, back before the murders came to light, Alec Murdaugh, after a lengthy period of negotiation, agreed to give the Satterfield family a confession of judgment. What that meant was he agreed that he was responsible for the theft of the Satterfield's money, and that because of that, he owed them what he had stolen from them. So he gave the Satterfield sons a confession of judgment for $4.3 million, I think. Might be 4.6, somewhere over 4 million. Then what happened, of course, was the Eric Bland and Richter went back to the people who should have been watching out to make sure that Alec Murdaugh wasn't stealing client money. And that was the folks at Palmetto State Bank and the folks at PMPED, which was the law firm that Murdaugh worked for. And in fact, his grandfather or great-grandfather had founded. So They went back against those two entities and recovered around $7 million. Now, this is not money that was paid to them on behalf of the Satterfield sons. This was money that they paid because they were responsible for not supervising Alec. So they agreed to settle the claims that the Satterfield sons had against those organizations individually for having failed them and failed their fiduciary duties to the Satterfield sons. That is a separate lawsuit. It has nothing to do with the money that the insurance company paid out on behalf of Gloria Satterfield. So there are two things going on. They went to Bland and Richter went to those two organizations and said, look, either settle up or we're going to sue. They demanded, because you're responsible for letting Alec misappropriate all this money. So they all settled with them, and they settled for somewhere around $7 million. But the Satterfield sons also still have a judgment against Alec individually for the money he stole. So the money he stole is in addition to the money that the organizations paid out to compensate the Satterfield sons for their lack of oversight. So two different things. Now, it's possible that a judge could say it wouldn't be fair to allow the Satterfield sons to be enriched by this additional $4 million. I think there's a good legal argument that, in fact, they're probably entitled to both. However, now Alec Murdaugh has come out and said, I lied through my teeth. The dogs didn't cause Gloria's fall. I just knew, because I'm an insurance attorney, that if I blamed my dog, it's strict liability, meaning I don't have to prove that my liability, and she could get paid. So I lied and said she tripped over our dogs. Now, Maggie and Paul both gave statements to law enforcement saying that Gloria tripped over the dogs. Gloria, at one point, one of the last cogent things she said was she tripped over the dogs. So who knows who's lying and who's telling the truth? In the Alec Murdaugh case, it's very difficult to figure out who might be lying and who might be telling the truth. But what has happened is Alec's lawyers then filed these motions saying, oh, no, we want to withdraw that confession of judgment. We want the court to let us withdraw that. And we don't believe that Alec should be responsible for that confession of judgment. And Bland and Richter now have taken off the gloves and have said they've hit the BS button. They basically have said that is not going to fly. We spent months negotiating the resolution. You knew exactly what was going on. Alec was, this was not a quickly reached confession of judgment. That was done while he was under the influence of opioids, which is what they claim. And he used it to his benefit in the trial by being able to say, look, yes, I did all these bad things. I stole from all these people. But, oh, by the way, I've given them a confession of judgment and taken responsibility for it. So it's pretty interesting. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. If you want to laugh, take a look at Bland and Richter's motion. It's filled with golf references. It basically is structured around golf references, and that they don't get a mulligan. So it's worth a read just because it's kind of snarky and amusing. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. Of course, Alex still got all kinds of federal charges pending, and we have absolutely no idea what's going to happen with those as well. And then the final case that I wanted to talk about is the case of Madeline Kingsbury. And there's a reason I wanted to talk about this case. I think that we haven't talked enough recently about the issues of domestic violence and the fact that how often it contributes to cases like this. So Madeline Kingsbury, this case is out of Minnesota. She was 27 and had a boyfriend, Adam Fravel, who is 29. And on March 31st, Madeline went missing. According to Mr. Fravel, he went with her when she dropped their two children, 3 and younger, I think, 3 and 1, I think, off at daycare. And she didn't show up that night to pick the kids up. They had a very rocky relationship. They had been kind of on and off. And at that moment, according to her, were off. So she disappeared on March 31st. On April 4th, law enforcement told Child Protective Services, we think the kids are at risk. We're very suspicious that this guy may have been involved in her disappearance. We're not comfortable having the children because since her disappearance, the 2 children have been with him. Social workers came out and to take the kids. When they got there, they needed the assistance of law enforcement to remove the kids. He was yelling and cussing and slamming the door on them. And eventually he turned the children over to them. However, he refused to give them any of the children's belongings, supplies, clothing, anything. So Child Protective Services placed the children in a temporary relative placement with Madeline's parents, with maternal grandparents. And there was a hearing on the 7th. There was an emergency shelter hearing. That's usually what happens, is within 24 hours, there has to be a hearing. And the judge ordered the kids to remain in care. He waited to make a decision until the 12th of April, when he agreed that he would order the children to continue in CPS care and awarded the father supervised parenting time. Now, when I was practicing, I did a lot of child welfare work, so I'm very familiar with the way this process works. One of the things that happens is we get these overlapping issues because juvenile court, child protective court, is a different jurisdiction than family court, where we're dealing with custody, parenting time, divorce, all of those issues. So what happens is they overlap. So Mr. Fravel filed a petition for legal custody of both of the children. He did not have legal custody of the children. Mom did, Madeline did. And so when, of course, she's disappeared, he then goes down and files a petition for custody of the children. The grandparents then have temporary custody of the children as relative foster caregivers, because the children are within the jurisdiction of the juvenile court. It gets complicated because these two jurisdictions overlap. So he filed a petition for custody in family court on the 5th of June. And they had a hearing. Actually, I think he filed the petition earlier, but they had a hearing on the 5th of June. And the grandparents were saying they wanted custody of the children. and that they continued to say that they had been awarded temporary custody under the child protective system's jurisdiction. So the judge denied. What happens in these cases is that the child protective action trumps the civil family court action and orders. So, for instance, if he had had legal custody of the children and they had been taken into protective custody in the juvenile court, that order would have superseded the underlying family order. So it takes precedence because it's a child safety issue. So the court said, I'm not going to decide that because it is a family court issue, but I'm going to continue the Child Protective Act order, which supersedes the family court. That was on the 5th of June. On the 7th of June, her body was finally found. She was found in an area that had been searched several times. It's an area close by where Mr. Fravel's family lives. And there's ample evidence at this point, including GPS and other evidence that he was driving her van and that he drove just far enough to have deposited her body and come back. So he was arrested for for her murder. He's only been charged with second-degree murder because in Minnesota, to get to first-degree murder, it has to go to the grand jury. So they're waiting for it to be presented to the grand jury. In the meantime, the grandparents then went back to court and said, we want to terminate his parental rights. Now, termination of parental rights is a long and drawn-out process. It is not something that can happen on a dime. Generally, it happens when children are removed from the parents in a child protective action, and then the parents are given time to get their act together while the children are in foster care, and they're given lots of chances. And then there's a point at which the state says, we've given you all the chances, you haven't been able to get your act together, and so we're going to terminate your parental rights and free these children for adoption. But that is a lengthy process. It certainly does not happen overnight. And it was a little surprising that the grandparents went in as quickly as they did and said, we want to terminate his parental rights, because it just doesn't work that way. But the judge said, I'm not going to terminate his parental rights. The issue of the children's custody will have to be determined by the state and perhaps even in the family court at some point in the future, depending upon what happens to dad, who's in jail for mom's murder. But the court did suspend dad's visitation, which is a good thing. Initially, he was allowed supervised visitation after the children were removed from him and sent to grandma and grandpa. So it's a good thing that the court has now said that he can't have any contact with the children. The children are pretty young, so I question whether or not they would have anything to add to the story. And they were in daycare when mom disappeared. So it's a really interesting story. The issue, I think, is one where we don't talk about enough, and that's domestic violence. This was a couple who had a lengthy history of domestic violence witnessed by other people. In one instance, she was on a FaceTime call with a friend when he attacked her and the friend witnessed it. It was in front of the children. When she told him she didn't appreciate him trying to strangle her, he said, adjust. So, get used to it. What we know is that the domestic violence rates in this country are staggeringly constant. We have known for 30 years that, my 30-year career, we have been talking about trying to reduce domestic violence, making people aware, bringing it to people's attention, working hard at using Abuse Prevention Act orders and restraining orders, temporary TROs, whatever you call them in your particular state, to try and keep victims safe. And yet, and to raise awareness of the issue. And yet, the statistics are the same as they were 30 years ago. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men in their lifetime will be victims of domestic violence. I have experienced it in my own life. I know that many of the women I know have experienced it at some level or another. And it is something that we just cannot seem to get our arms around. We can't seem to make an impact. We're not making a dent in it these days. We know it's a cycle. We know that young people and children who are exposed to domestic violence are substantially more likely to repeat that cycle. We know that children who witness domestic violence are more likely to become victims or perpetrators. We know all of those things, but we still have not found a way to stop it, to interfere with it, to break the cycle. We know that the bulk of people who are in prison, adult prisons, are at one point experienced abuse. We know that they witnessed abuse of their parents. They were the victims of abuse at the hands of their parents. We know that happens. And we also know that intervening early in these families is the only way to begin to head that off. But here's the problem. We also have a constitution that guarantees that people have a right to privacy. They have a right to be safe and secure in their own homes, to not be subject to illegal search and seizure. We know all of those things. And that is the tightrope that we walk when we are trying to intervene in these situations. When do we jump in and intervene in a way, and how do we do it in a way that's effective? To date, we're not finding it. Intervening, prosecuting, a lot of states have changed their statutes so that if a domestic violence incident is reported, one of the combatants must be arrested. It's not optional. You can't just say, oh, it's a family matter and you'll sort it out. One of those people has to go to jail that night. However, and then what we do is we take that person, we prosecute them, where they're being mandated to participate in anger management programs. Over the years, they've discovered the short-term programs don't work. And so now oftentimes they're required to attend weekly classes for up to a year. And we're still not seeing any reduction in these numbers. It's a perplexing, frustrating problem that we just don't seem to be able to impact. And maybe it's time to look for some more creative ways. In some of the Scandinavian countries, If you have an issue within your home, they move an experienced caseworker coach into your home 24/7. They live with you and they coach you on how to raise your children, how to have a healthy relationship, and they coach. And they stay as long as it takes to get this family back on track. Now, clearly, we in America aren't going to tolerate that for 13 seconds. It's not going to fly. We know it, their statistics show it's effective, but it's not something that we would ever implement here. So it's an ongoing issue. And every time we see one of these cases like Madeline Kingsbury come up, we think, oh, we need to do better about domestic violence. But the truth is, we're not doing better yet. And I'm not sure I know what the answer is. After 30 years of working in criminal law, after 30 years of representing petitioners in restraining order hearings, of 30 years of doing child custody work, of 30 years of doing child protective cases, I don't know the answer. So we really need to step our game up. And I think it would be great if all of you started brainstorming and talking to your public servants, not just your senators and your at the federal level or even at the state level, but talking to your local politicians at the county level where the services are provided, and talking to them about how we resolve this problem, because it is a vicious cycle. So that is what I have for today's rant. I do have a few other things I want to talk about while Michelle is looking for the first of our questions. So I'm ready to take questions, and Michelle can start queuing those up. In the meantime, I did want to talk about a couple things. First of all, there won't be a True Crime Wednesday next week because I'm having hip replacement surgery. I'll be posting to let you know how I'm doing, but I wouldn't expect there to be one. I know there won't be one next week because my surgery's on Wednesday. And it's a touch and go as to whether there'll be one the following week or not. So bear with me, and I will definitely post updates about how I'm doing. And I appreciate all of you who've given me good wishes and assured me that either they or someone they know and love has been through it and that it's survivable, because I'm a little apprehensive about it. I can't lie. The recovery's a little scary. So before I get to Squeaky Wheel's question, one more thing. For those of you who have asked, CrimeCon is happening in September. It's the week of September 24th. So it's that weekend. Let me give you the absolute accurate dates, because I also want you to know that there are some really exciting things coming up for CrimeCon next year. So if you have any desire to go to CrimeCon, please come out and support. It is this year, CrimeCon is September 22nd through 24th, and it is in Orlando, Florida. So if you live in the local area or you're close by, you might want to come in. You might want to join us. I had a blast last year when I went. Last year it was in the spring on the West Coast in Las Vegas, and it was way too much fun. I met a lot of great creators. I met people I only knew online. I met lots of people who follow us, and it was amazing. So if you have the opportunity to go, please join us this year. The big news is that next year's CrimeCon, and we don't know where, but it'll be somewhere on the West Coast, next year's Crime Con is going to be May 31st through June 2nd. And at that Crime Con, we're going to launch my book. I've been talking to my publisher about it. The book is actually going to physically hit the shelves in September of next year. But we're going to do pre-sales and launch events at CrimeCon in May of 2024. So if y'all have the chance, save your money and come on out to CrimeCon, because it is a blast and we're going to have so much fun doing launch events. Now let's get to Squeaky Wheel. If you were still practicing and assigned to the Taylor Shabusiness case, how would you go about trying to defend her? This is a good question. Let me just give you a quick little rundown on Taylor Shabusiness. Now, brace yourself, because this is raw information. I'm giving y'all a trigger warning right now. It is a super creepy, unpleasant case that includes just about every weird, creepy aspect that you can think of. So, Taylor Shabusiness, y'all are going to have to help me with the victim's name, because I can't pull it up right now. But they were friends from high school, had been, by all accounts, friends with benefits. They both apparently were interested in some kind of non-traditional forms of being friends with benefits, trying to make this as family friendly as possible. And they also had been using methamphetamine quite a bit. Shad trailer. Thank you, Dawn. That's exactly right. So they were in reportedly grandma's or his mother's home in the basement, and smoking meth. At one point, they were using trazodone. They were grinding it up and shooting it IV. I mean, they were into some pretty serious methamphetamine use. We know that methamphetamine can cause some really severe, at the most severe point, it can cause meth-induced psychosis. So we know that methamphetamine can cause some breaks with reality. So in the process of their long meth binge and having a lot of unusual friends with benefits activity, including some bondage, Shad was strangled. I don't know that anyone is entirely clear whether that was intentional or accidental because of what they were involved in. However, she then admits that in her meth haze, she dismembered his body and did a lot of other stuff that probably would get me banned from YouTube for talking about. So, the mother came home, couldn't find the son, didn't know what was going on, and discovered this grisly scene, including his head in a bucket. And Taylor Shabusiness was arrested. So now that we have that grisly story out of the way, the question is, if I were still practicing and assigned to her case, how would I go about trying to defend her? Well, I think it would be very important. And I also want to say that there's video out there on YouTube of her physically attacking her own lawyer. So she's certainly got some substantial mental illness issues. I think the very first thing I would do is have a complete psychological workup done, a complete forensic workup done. I would want to know, is she currently competent? And I would want certainly for a reputable and well-known psychologist to take a long, hard look at Ms. Shabiznis and whether or not she was competent at the time of the crime. Now, I completely understand that what she has done is absolutely heinous, but let's remember that these are, I mean, these are actions that are so far outside the realm of normal behavior. You got to ask yourself, what is it at play here that would allow someone to do that? So I have to wonder whether Shad's death was accidental, and then because of her meth-induced psychosis, she was trying to cover it up. I think we don't really know enough about the facts of the case to be able to judge that. But if it were me, the very first thing I would do would be to get a complete psychological workup on this woman and make sure that I had a client that was competent and able to aid and assist, first of all. And then second, whether or not there was some sort of insanity defense available. Now, in most states, you cannot claim insanity if your lack of ability to be competent is because of your own use of drugs or alcohol. So if you affirmatively use drugs and alcohol to the point where you are so intoxicated that you do not understand what you're doing, that is not a basis for a mental illness defense. But her actions prior to what happened and her actions after what happened would be important to know. So I think that that's where I would start, would be to make sure that this person is actually competent. I think anybody who attacks their own lawyer in court might have some substantial issues that need to be dealt with and that maybe predate the meth-induced psychosis of that particular day. So, we know that drug addiction can be a symptom as well as a disease. And so I think that's where I would probably start. Yeah, I squeaky wheel. I see your post in the comments, and I do know that, and I do know that there was certainly a sexual overtone to the crime. But again, I don't know how much the meth-induced psychosis had to play in it, how much her own pre-existing mental illness had to play in it. I will grant you it's a weird case and it's very troubling and it is very difficult to understand how somebody could do what she did. But then Jeffrey Dahmer was in the world too. So yeah, that's going to be an interesting one to watch. The other one that I have been watching, and I want to get the name right because he's got an interesting, funny name, is the rapper who has been on trial in a murder case. And his name is one thing, and his rap name is another. He goes by YNW Melly, and he is accused of having murdered two of his friends. And it's really an interesting case. So this is a young man who was sort of a rising rap star with two of his other three of his friends, childhood friends. And there was a lot going on. They were sort of starting to catch on. And so people were getting interested in them, and there was some money to be made, a fairly sizable amount of money to be made. There were discussions about whether or not they were going to sell their brand, that YNW, and I have no idea what that stands for. Maybe somebody else does. But each one of them was YNW something. So the two guys that died were YNW Juvie and YNW something Sack. And so the allegation is that he was sitting in the back seat and that he shot two of his friends. Interesting that there's some discussion about whether or not he was trying to join a gang, and whether or not that gang was that this could have been a gang initiation. It's interesting that the defense is trying to differentiate between his rap persona and the persona that he portrayed in his rap videos from who he was as a person day to day. It's also interesting the defense has gone heavily after the investigation, saying that the investigation was botched. But we haven't gotten far into it yet, so we haven't gotten far into the forensics, and but supposedly the forensics indicate he claimed that they were caught in a drive-by shooting. Apparently, the forensics indicate that the shots that killed the two victims came from the back seat of the car, and that it was only after they were already dead that then this defendant went out and shot up the car to make it look like a drive-by, but that the actual shots that came from that killed the two victims came from the back seat. So that's an interesting case to follow. The police officer Scott Peterson, who was the school resource officer during the Parkland shooting, is still on trial as well. I think the rapper case is really interesting. I also I think there's some good lawyering going on there. So if you like watching trials for good lawyering, I think that they're doing a good job. And I will also say the defendant, this YNW Melly, his attorney doesn't have much control over how he's behaving at counsel table. And so it's kind of interesting to watch. Yeah. So, anybody else got cases that they would like to talk about or that we should be following? Let me know and we'll take a look at those. I think that the Alyssa Turner case has been really interesting, and will continue to be interesting. And I think there's a really interesting tie-in to the issue of how social media impacts true crime and these kinds of stories these days. Hey, Kathleen, how much of domestic violence is rooted in the way we raise children, how we train children according to gender? The Duggar documentary shows that. I think that's an interesting point. I do think that we are still raising children with specific gender roles. I'm guilty of it as much as anybody. I was raised in a very gender specific family, and to some extent, I still fulfill those woman gender roles in my family, and I think that it is a hard mold to break. And I agree that when taken to its extreme, like we saw in the Duggar documentary, where the boys are all laying around doing nothing and the girls are doing all the work, that certainly can be an issue. I think the bigger issue in the way that we raise children is the exposure to violence. I think that it sneaks in our media, no matter how cautious we are. And certainly, if there is violence going on within the household, that is the biggest factor. We absolutely know, there is no doubt that that children who are exposed to violence in their homes, particularly violence between mother and father, or violence toward from the parents toward the children, are at absolutely much higher risk to become offenders or become victims. I think it's less likely for children who have not been exposed to it to become victims. So I think it's super important that we see something, say something. If you have suspicions that a child that you know is being exposed to domestic violence, please, please, please say something. Kathleen, I just saw your post. You were raised Catholic, and your Catholic dad's greatest ambition was for you to marry a nice Catholic boy and make lots of Catholic babies. I completely understand, and I understand that we have a responsibility to our children, and particularly to our daughters, to educate our children about that this kind of behavior is wrong, and that it is not okay for them to ever be victims of violence, and it's not okay for them to remain silent if their friends are being victimized. So Denicia, Lori, with your experience, do you think removing the kids if they've witnessed domestic violence is helpful? I have mixed feelings. Is it more trauma to kids? Will mom be at greater risk? I don't know. Wow, this is a really thorny question. And this is why I love you guys so much, because you don't ask the easy questions. We're well beyond what's an indictment. And I appreciate that you ask these kind of questions. Removing children from their parents, no matter how utterly deficient the parents are, is incredible trauma for children, and it lasts a lifetime. And so I have very strong feelings about children not being removed from their families, if at all possible. But there are some circumstances where the situation is so dangerous that the children have to be removed. My preference would always be to remove mom and the children together to a safe place and be able to help these parents, whether they stay together or apart, to try and overcome those hurdles. Now, I am not ignorant. After 30 years of practicing law, 27 years, I know that the recovery rates for domestic violence perpetrators is low. I'm going to tell you that it's down there with the recovery rate for sex offenders. I'm not making this stuff up. The problem is that you get this person who has been this seething cauldron of anger and has never learned how to effectively deal with their anger except with their fists. And you try and rehabilitate that person. And even somebody who desperately wants to change, it's hard. And I would submit that most of these people don't desperately want to change. And in fact, most of them see absolutely nothing wrong with their behavior because it's all they know. And they don't have the kind of personal insight into their behavior that would help them change. So my preference is always to move victims away from the perpetrator and to keep mom and the children together whenever it's possible. But that's not always that possible. I mean, it's not always that realistic to think that you're going to be able to talk mom into separating from this person who may be her only source of income and her only source of security, and trying to get her into a better situation. It is a thorny issue. And this is a great question. I'm not sure I have a great answer for it. But I will say that in general, it is more damaging for children to be removed from their parents than it is for them to have witnessed domestic violence. I think witnessing domestic violence, the children can be helped to process that, can be helped through that in a healthy way. The trauma of being removed and particularly placed with strangers is immeasurable. I do see, Lisa, I saw that super sticker come up earlier. I just want to say thank you so much for supporting us and supporting our mods. As you know, all of our super chats go directly to our moderator, and I appreciate her help and in everything she does for us. So thanks so much for your support. It means the world to us. We have about 400 folks in the chat. If you have not subscribed, please do. If you have not hit the like button, please do. It really helps our standing in the world of algorithm of YouTube. And please hit the notification button because we do go live when things happen. I don't expect that we're going to be doing a lot of surprise lives in the next month or two. But we do go live when things come up that need to be talked about right away. So please hit the subscribe and the notification button so you'll get those notices when we go live. Marcy J, have you been following the Megan Emmerich case? What are your thoughts? This is not a case I'm familiar with, but I'm going to make a note and I am going to look it up because if you are interested, so am I. I am IROWICZ. So I'll look it up and hopefully we'll be able to chat about it when I'm back on next time. So why can't Annie Cushing make a statement? She is a blood aunt of Tylee. Can there only be one victim statement per victim? No, not as far as I know. There can't be only one victim. I don't know why the judge felt, other than the fact that the statute says aunts and uncles are not, I have to go back and look at the statute, but I think the statute says that aunts and uncles are not in the immediate family rubric. What makes me remember that is because the judge said that legally Kay and Larry were aunt and uncle. They weren't grandparents, and so they didn't. Larry didn't qualify. The only reason Kay qualified was because she was appointed by the court to be JJ's representative, the same way that Summer was appointed to be Tylee's representative. I think it's unfortunate that Annie's not going to be able to present a statement, but I mean, I understand the judge is following the law. I think the law in Idaho needs to change. And for all of you that are in Idaho, take note that I think that their definition of who is immediate family and who is a victim needs some work. So you're right, Kathleen. Summer is Tylee's aunt to the same extent that Annie Cushing is. I think the difference is that the court appointed her to be the representative for Tylee. Ladybug Lady. As a nurse of over 20 years, and I have seen DV victims generally have no safe place to go. Any thoughts? So I have a lot of thoughts about this. I think one of the most important, if you are looking for some place to put your donation dollars, your charitable donations, please consider your local domestic violence shelter. Most communities have a domestic violence shelter. They don't nearly have enough beds to protect the people who need it, all of the people who need it at once. Most counties also, thanks to the Violence Against Women Act, which has been, it receives federal funding. Most counties have some sort of funding available for temporary housing, and also may have grants to help people pay first and last month's rent, or may be able to help with renting a U-Haul or any of those sorts of expenses to get families out of those violent situations. But we run into this problem all the time where we have someone who has not worked outside the home, who doesn't have the ability to run right out and earn a paycheck, and who has young children to take care of, and who is financially dependent on their abuser. It is more common than not, frankly. So I hope that we are moving in a direction of providing more services and more opportunities available to get victims out of their abusive situations. But it's a matter of funding, and we all know those funding dollars get spread pretty thin. Barty B. Do you think Boyce could have taken into account that there was no one to speak for Tammy and let her aunt, who was the only one who applied, speak? Or would that be against Idaho code? You know, I think you're right. The judge could appoint someone from Tammy's family to speak for her family. Certainly her parents could have. Her mother just passed away this late last week, I think. And I'm sure that her family is reeling from that. I think one of her siblings could potentially be appointed as well. So one of Tammy's siblings certainly would be allowed to present a statement if they applied. So we don't know for sure whether other people will apply before the July 1st deadline, but at this point, the judge has said he's going to follow the Idaho statute on who is considered immediate family. Zero. Lori, can a victim like Crescia send a letter to state attorney to be forwarded to the judge and perhaps read? No. First of all, I don't think the judge is going to read anything that doesn't come from the immediate family. I think that his order is pretty clear that he believes the victims who should have input into the victim impact statement and who should have input at sentencing are the ones that are allowed by statute. Crescia can send letters anywhere she wants, but I suspect that Judge Boyce is absolutely going to adhere to the order that he wrote, because that's why he wrote it. So I don't necessarily agree that that they should be excluded, but I think the judge is on sound legal ground. Moral ground, different story, but he's on strong legal ground for justifying it. So. Rachel Gamber. Eric Bland has stated, Eric Bland is Gloria Satterfield's son's attorney, has stated that there's a grand jury for Stephen Smith. He also represents Sandy Smith, who is Stephen Smith's mother. Now, those of you who may not be completely familiar with the Murdaugh case may not understand how all of these things are related. Stephen Smith was a young nursing student who was a contemporary of Buster Murdaugh, and he was murdered, and he was his death initially was ruled as a hit and run, as an accidental death. But there were tremendous rumors that somehow the Murdaugh family was involved. There's never been any evidence that the Murdaugh family was involved, other than the fact that Randy Murdaugh was on the scene pretty quickly after Stephen's body was found. So Eric Bland also represents his mother, Sandy Smith, and I think it's been 7 or 8 years since Stephen was killed. They ran a campaign and a GoFundMe to get Stephen's body exhumed, and an autopsy was completed. And it appeared that there was information revealed in the autopsy that was significant. And they have continued since that autopsy, which was a couple months ago, to investigate. And SLED, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, that's their state police, has said that the investigation is ongoing and that they had some viable leads. I did hear that Eric Bland said that there was going to be a grand jury convened in the case. That usually means that there is a viable suspect. And the public will learn what's going on when charges come out, when there's a charging document that comes out of the grand jury. So I hope sincerely that the people responsible for Stephen's death are brought to justice, because I believe wholeheartedly that he was murdered. I have some serious doubts about how the Murdaughs were involved. I don't believe that Buster Murdaugh was involved in his death, but there was a lot of speculation to that. A lot of it having to do with the fact that one of the Murdaugh lawyers was involved early on. And to be honest, I don't know what that means. The Murdaugh family, their tentacles went out all over the counties around where they lived. And so it could have nothing at all to do with Buster or with the Murdaugh family. It could have to do with Randy doing a favor for somebody completely unrelated. So I hope we'll find out soon, but I think we'll find out if and when they bring more charges. Anybody got more questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap up a little early tonight. So please do. I do want to say, we try and get to everybody's questions, but it's always complicated. And on a night like tonight, when we have only 437 of you in chat, Michelle's a little better able to keep up with the questions. We have 1,100 in chat, it gets a little challenging. So, but I also know that not everybody is ready to have their questions posted in chat. So if you decide that you would like to drop me a question, you can always drop it in the comments here on YouTube, or you can email me. And my email's in the show notes. please feel free to email. I must admit that since I've been writing every day and since the trial began, I'm a little behind on answering emails, but I do answer them. So please do. Somebody asked me about Justice for Tylee and JJ bracelets. They're still available. You can get those by sending me a self-addressed stamped envelope. That means address it to yourself and put a stamp on it. Put that envelope in one addressed to me, and I will send you a bracelet at no charge. So you're just paying the postage. I do have probably about 10 envelopes that I haven't sent off yet, but we'll get those out to you all shortly. And you can certainly drop us a note if you would like to that same address. If you happen to be a letter writer, I do get letters from lots of nice people. I wanted to say, when I heard, this is just a little aside. When I heard that Lindsay Blake's father had passed away right in the middle of this trial, I felt for her. I felt for her for having had this case that she has been preparing for 3 years, and to have this sudden and tragic death of her father in the middle of it was, it takes an incredibly strong person to be able to navigate that and not have it impact your ability to function. So when I heard that she had lost her father, I dropped her a personal note and sent her a copy of a poem that I have found really comforting in times of loss. And I didn't do it for any other reason than she's a human and I am, and I felt for her. But it was interesting because I got a note back from her on her official prosecutor letterhead, thanking me for reaching out with condolences and the poem. So I was very surprised to receive that. Y'all know what my track record has been with the court. I can't say how people perceive me within the prosecution or the defense. We know that Jim Archibald pointed me out in court, so we know what his feelings are, but I can't say. But I was pleasantly surprised to receive that. So I appreciate what a good job she did in spite of some really awful circumstances. And I appreciate, as a lawyer, the times that we are called to set aside what's going on in our personal lives, what's going on in our hearts, and compartmentalize that and go forward and get our jobs done. And I think that's kind of uniquely, it's unique to some professions like lawyers and doctors, and having to really sort of compartmentalize our world and move on. So I was impressed with how she handled it, and I was pleased to get a little note back from her. I want to thank Hazelnut for your super chat, and thank you that you enjoyed the live, and also thanks for good wishes for my surgery. I'm not usually a wimp, but I have to tell you, I'm a little apprehensive about this one. So send me good juju on Wednesday morning. So if we don't have any more questions, I think we'll sign off. Oh, where are the quilt blocks? I have been working on the quilt blocks, and actually they're in a stack on my ironing board. I don't know whether you can see or not. There they are, the stack on my ironing board. And I've been working on the cornerstones, and I was really hoping that before my surgery, I would get it all put together and sent off to be quilted, because my goal, once it's quilted, is to do a little bit of a raffle and to donate all the proceeds to the Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So I'm going to try my best to get the top finished and get it sandwiched and the backing all together so that I can get it in the mail to be quilted. And then soon I'll be able to share that all with you. So the quilt blocks are down off the wall and in a stack so that I can get them put together. It is lap quilt size, so not huge, but I think it's going to turn out pretty cool. So, and please, if you have pictures of your quilt blocks, and you have pictures of your completed quilt tops, send them to me, because I would love to share them on our next live to let everybody know and share everybody's hard work. And I've gotten a few and they're beautiful. So send them all to me and we will do a little quilt fashion show with all your quilts and blocks. Hi, Melanie. You know, you didn't miss it because I didn't mention it. I am intending to go to Lori's sentencing, and that is the end of July. So I'm hoping by then I will be well enough to make a 4-hour drive. But I have lots of folks who are more than happy to go with me from the local area. So I'm as far as I know, I'm planning to go, absent any sort of weird complications, which people tell me I shouldn't have. So I want to thank you all for being here. It is always, thank you so much. It is always such a pleasure to spend time with all of you. I enjoy it so much. I was so nervous to start this channel, so afraid of the crazy learning curve that comes along with trying to learn new technology and platforms. And you all have been so generous and so kind. And I enjoy spending time with you. I don't regret it a bit. I'm going to say good night. Have a great weekend. Thank you again, Michelle, for always being such a wonderful moderator. And I will see you in 2 weeks. Good night.